Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Prospanica's webinar series discussing Latino masculinity in today's corporate culture. My name is Jeffrey Vargas, and I serve as President and CEO of Generationology. We're an organization that helps companies learn how to lead and manage across generations, helping 25-year-olds figure out how to manage 50-year-olds and 50-year-olds how to manage 25-year-olds without killing each other. I have the good fortune today and the honor and real privilege of serving as today's moderator. Joining us, and we have one panelist that's on his way. He's going to be with us shortly, but who we have online right now, we have Dr. George Bermudez. He is the core faculty and director of the Child Family Studies specialization at Antioch University in Los Angeles. Um, Dr. George has been involved in working with Latino families for more than 30 years. He even started a program called Project Fatherhood, and he has lots to share with us on this whole thought and ideology around male masculinity. Also with us is Jason Rosario. He's the founder of The Lives of Men. He's a very compassionate man who's created a platform of digital storytelling that really helps men navigate and find a compass in terms of their journey, both through corporate America. He gives folks a platform to ask questions and get answers. And I know that will be happening with us later today. Also, and again, he'll be with us in a moment, will be Mark Madrid. Mark is CEO of the Latino Business Action Network, which works in coordination with Stanford University's Latino Entrepreneur Initiative. And just on time, there's Mark who's joining us. And they are focused on research, education, and building scale of Latino businesses across the United States. Let me just say up front that we are going to have a spirited, authentic, high energy conversation about male masculinity, Latino male masculinity, which in my 30 plus years in work has not been a conversation that we've had often, if ever. And I think today I would ask that all of you do something that we do in our company, is that you have either a notebook, you use your screen, some way to capture what we would call aha moments. Those will be moments that you had an aha, some sort of insight that you would then choose to be able to write down, capture, and then apply. In many cases, we in fact are our brother's keeper. And this is an example of what that looks like, where we have the opportunity to share insights. And I know just in short dialogue with these men that they're here because they care about other men and they care about all of you. And so on that note, as we are all familiar, most of us are familiar, the Latino community continues to grow. We're 17% of the population. We'll be a 1/4% of the entire nation by 2050. We are in many states becoming the majority of those populations. Yet we are not seeing the same transfer over into corporate America. And if we think about what male masculinity has meant over a number of years, I'd like to start off by asking our good professor, George, what was male masculinity like, say, 15 or 20 years ago? What's changed? And moreover, what are some of the points of male masculinity that should be emphasized today?
That's a really good question. I've been working with Latino fathers for a really long time. I presented at a number of conferences, and one of the things I've learned is that unfortunately there's still the sort of cultural narrative out there that Latino men are machista. And so I decided, well, we've got to really look at this. What is really going on? And what I discovered was that there is actual research on this, looking at Latino men from a variety of nationalities, essentially. And what was discovered was that only 10% of those men actually can be categorized as a traditional machista kind of personality, an authoritarian, constricted affect and emotion. The only emotion apparently is anger and a lack of adaptive abilities. And the research shows is that there's an entire continuum of Latino masculinity, and they've tried to categorize it in complex ways, from a compassionate machismo to a traditional and so on. But the startling finding is that Latino men have changed dramatically, and maybe the stereotype never existed, to where they're seen and express themselves as more compassionate, less constricted in their affect, and flexible. It's extraordinary. But the narrative is still out there, and it's a narrative, I think, that Latino men unfortunately have also internalized. And I can talk a little bit later about the stereotype thread and stereotype lift and the impact it has. When you experience an environment that still attributes to you those cultural narratives.
Jason, what would you share with respect to some insights on Latino male masculinity?
Yeah, well, one of the, yeah. So,
No, please go ahead, George.
no, it's okay. Go ahead.
Insights. I think I'm not a professor. I don't have a PhD in masculinity studies. All I have is my lived experience in the space.
Right.
But I will say that I think there is a narrative prevailing that unfortunately not just Latino men, but Black men, men of color in general,
Yeah.
are subscribing to this notion that masculinity or machismo or patriarchy, as it were, is more attributable to being a man. And what does that mean? And I think what my work tries to do is to try to educate our audience around what is masculinity as a social construct, how does that play out in different spaces, and to try to debunk some of those myths associated with who we are as men. Unfortunately, there are a lot of elements that I see plaguing our community that, for me, I'll slightly disagree with respect to what Dr. Bermuda said, in that there are elements in our community that continue to present themselves in toxic ways, right? The misogyny, misogynoir, different types of behavior patterns that we continue to see in our community that unfortunately lend credence to those who say that machismo and misogyny and patriarchy are still a problem amongst the Latino community. So, it's definitely layered, it's nuanced, but I think it's what I am excited to see is that there is this new paradigm shift in the conversation to talk about, men from a healing perspective and how we need to heal ourselves from within to try to start to address some of the behaviors.
And speaking of the changes that are taking place, I know, Mark, you are with your Latino network. You're working every day with high energy Latino entrepreneurs that want to make a difference in the world. Great aspiration versus challenges of execution. What are some thoughts when you think about Latino male masculinity in corporate America today?
Well, first of all, thank you for having the boldness and courage to put this type of webinar on, and thank you for all of you joining us today. I have a different lens to this conversation that I've had to grapple with, honestly, for the better portion of 46 years. I grew up definitely in a machismo world and atmosphere, and suffered some child injustices, including being molested as a child by machismos. And then later on in life, it took me 45 years, but I came out as a gay Latino male. And so I have grown up in a social construct deep-rooted in patriarchy, and developed and cultivated, unfortunately, some toxic machismo qualities, whether they were overt or implicit. And I'm still reconciling those today. So all these, you talked about layers of nuances. I definitely have those. And so I think for me, the biggest progress and the biggest area of opportunity is the notion of being vulnerable and being a man. They can occur. They can coexist. And it doesn't, if you're vulnerable, which is very important today, especially with millennials and young Latinos and Latinas for that matter, they want to see authentic leadership. They can see right through you. There's this concept of real, in terms of, manifesting like a Disney-like quality in terms of,
Yes.
that magical experience where when you go there, it is real. And so I think we can learn a lot from young Latinos, actually, but they need our help. They need our cultivation, and we need to help our own selves as well. When it comes to entrepreneurs, almost 50% now of all Latinx entrepreneurs are Latinas. And so that is, I say Latinas are not only running households if they choose, but they're driving our American economy. and so when it comes to a situation where a patriarch has run the business for 30 years, a scaled business, let's say a $10 million business, which is very rare in our ecosystem at this point, and we're trying to change that, but passing that business on to a daughter potentially, I think I'm seeing some issues there, but I'm also seeing some vulnerability, some openness, and it is very, very healthy, and I think it definitely bleeds into this discussion here.
And on that note, one of the terminologies we utilize in my work is social proofing, right? Young people want social proof. They just don't want you to say you're an expert. It'd be nice if a few other people agreed with that as well. And really,
street cred, Jeff.
Street cred, you got that right.
Right.
And you led us down an important path there, Mark. When we talk about vulnerability and living authentically, I'd like to hear from both from George and from Jason, from this aspect. There are so many people that are trying to live out their lives, as you were saying earlier, on social media, and people are being bombarded with thoughts and ideas of what it means to be male, to experience male masculinity. What advice would you have for young men and those who are in the corporate world, those who are on our webinar right now, to get in touch with their most authentic self? What are some things that you would recommend that they do? I'll start with Jason, and then we'll go to Dr. George.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think it's something that, I answer that in terms of how it's happened for me. It's just, as a product of a single parent home led by a woman, surrounded by women in my family, and surrounded by women in my life, friends, cousins, my daughter, my partner. You learn how to be a man, through trial and error in many cases, right? And just trial by fire, making a lot of mistakes. But I'd say the first thing is listen and be willing to listen. Be willing to listen to the women in your life when they tell you certain things about your behavior, about your thought patterns, about certain things that aren't working for them as it relates to how you're showing up for them. Be willing to listen, and then be willing to course correct. I think it's very difficult for men who are unfortunately affected by and subject to patriarchal systems to really take the position of self-reflection and self-awareness enough to say, you know what, maybe I'm not showing up in the best way. Maybe I am. Maybe I do need to look at my behavior and think about different ways to show up. So I think number one is listen. Be willing to listen to not just the women in our lives, but men who might have had more experience than us in relationships or in life generally. Be willing to listen, but then be willing to and have the courage to course correct in instances where you're being called out on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Dr. George?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it requires a kind of humility and ability to self-reflect. But what I've learned, one of the ethical demands of my profession, I imagine most of our professions, is self-assessment, right? The ability to self-assess. But I realized that it's kind of a mythology. I mean, if you've got blind spots, it's very hard to find those blind spots without feedback. So I couldn't agree more with you, Jason, that you need to be able to receive the feedback you're getting. And sometimes it's very explicit, sometimes it's implicit. The internal work I've been involved with men is, for me, profoundly moving. I discover the enormous creativity and power, but the fear, vulnerability, and the hurts they've experienced in the past. And I think about my own father. This guy would leave at 4 a.m. He'd come back at 4 p.m, like clockwork. But I didn't find him as accessible as I wanted him to be. He was there for me. And in my own development, I've had to recover and sort of sift out what he gave me that I wanted to hold on to. Enormous commitment and reliability and hard work, and yet the constriction of emotions I had to let go of and do a journey inside. One of the things I'm working on now is how to use dreams to discover and find the truest part of ourselves. And dreams have a duality, I've discovered. They give us a metaphor for our ecology, our social context, and our innermost desires as well. So that's one of the areas that I hope people begin to explore more. Yeah.
Mark, would you like to add to that as well?
I would, in terms, I've had a transformation over different phases of my life. The first phase was I wanted to be the best Latino executive, the best Latino banker, the best Latino student. And I changed that. I said I want to be the best male president, the best male CEO. But then I transformed one more time. Said I want to be the best human. I want to be the best human. Anybody who knows me loves that I love to compete and I love to win, but I play by the rules. But in terms of being the best human possible, the best manager possible, etc., I'm learning from both men and women. And I'm learning, and I'm a competitive runner. I'm learning from both men and women. And so I think that frames us up to just unlock the good beast in all of us.
Excellent. You all three of you touched on it in one way or another, this important ideology of self-reflection, self-assessment, and I would argue humility. What are some things that you believe that that young men can do today to really give themselves an opportunity to actually put into practice some practical things people can do with respect to doing some self-reflection? What are some activities either you've done and or you've seen be successful in the past? Mark, we'll start with you and then we'll do a round robin with everybody.
Well, everybody talks about mentorship, but I want to break that down a little bit. You've got to build what I call an A-team, and building an A-team of people that you can trust that are outside of your family. For a while, I was going through all these emotions of anger and resentment and injustice and holding them right here, and that was not a healthy thing. It led to a lot of anger and a lot of this toxic machismo and disrespect for others and disrespect for my own self. The journey to getting that A-team and mentorship is not going to be an easy one. There's going to be people that disappoint you, not detract from having those confidants. And what I have now is always folks who have had more experience than I have, folks that I can relate to that have been in similar pathways. And so that for me to be able to call somebody or even text somebody that I trust is invaluable. Because that's led to to be honest with you, that's led to the highest degree of trajectory, both in my personal and professional life.
Excellent. Jason?
I think you touched on it, Mark, and I'll add to that, which is this element of being in service to others. I think you learn a lot about yourself when you give of yourself. And I think, when you think about what I've done personally in my life that has taught me so much about not just my own journey, but the journey of so many other men, is to work with the young men. One of the things that I do, I'm a big believer in that if you want to change the future, you have to start with the future, and the future are young people. And the way that I socialize my work and bring that to life is by working as a New York City Department of Education vendor in New York City high schools, where I conduct masculinity workshops and talk to young men about masculinity, what it is, what it's not, the social construct, dealing with authority both inside of the school, outside of the school, and really what that means. And I think what I try to drive home is trying to decouple this notion that masculinity means or equals competency, which it doesn't, right? So if you can decouple those two things and then have them see that they are themselves worthy just because they exist, I think that's a big, if they can start to see that, I think that creates a ripple effect throughout their lives. And I think that's what I'd like to see more young people do, is to look at themselves, look at the mirror, and identify and own their self-worth. Just because they exist, they matter. So that's one of the things that I want to see more of.
Excellent. Dr. George?
Yeah, that's a superb point. It links with what Mark was saying, that pursuit of the perfect Superman. That's the challenge, and unfortunately, we have such obvious models in our culture of you don't show weakness, You essentially never display that you're sorry, and it's an extraordinary display of wrong-headed, destructive masculinity that we're seeing the models in our culture. So I couldn't agree with you more. One of the challenges is how to struggle with learning how to trust. Many of us have internalized either absent fathers, authoritarian fathers, fathers who may have had noble intention because they may have thought this is the way I make my son a man, but not realizing that they were crushing the ability for many boys and men to find their voices. It's an extraordinary thing. I've been showing a film, it's called The Mask You Live In. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. I can't show it to an audience without tears. They start crying, I start crying. What we're doing to our boys and men in our culture, and Latino men particularly, and men of color, it's just extraordinary. So how do we find that ability to move towards a mentor, to trust, to be vulnerable, to open ourselves up, and get the kind of guidance and nourishment we really need to develop? It's a journey.
Yeah. Two thoughts as we continue this conversation, because I think we're getting into a very real and relevant space. You know, Jason, you talk about the masculinity workshop conduct in New York City public high schools. My suspicion is it's a microcosm of what's taking place all around our country. But if you can, just share for our audience members, because I think there's a lot of people out there that think they're the only one that's experienced A, B, or C. Can you share with us some of the things that you see that come up during these workshops, some of the experiences, the shared experiences that men, these young men discover they're having during your workshops? And I would argue that if we had those workshops in corporate America, we might be discovering the same things.
Yeah. I think the most important thing that comes up consistently is the shock that they feel when I point out the subtle ways that we uphold systems of oppression around patriarchy and machismo, much more than the overt ways, right? And I try to make that distinction very, very clear, in that just because you may not subscribe to traditional gender roles, for example, just because you know how to cook and clean for yourself, and just because you don't call women the B word or the H word, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not machista, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not upholding this system of oppression that prevails in our community. And so when I point those things out and the subtle behaviors, right? So for example, one of the behaviors that I use is, if you're ever driving and somebody cuts you off, a lot of times you'll be like, well, that must be a woman, right? Yeah. And that's not, so if you think about that, those are subtle examples of how we continue to perpetuate that. So that's one example. The other example that I try to really hammer home is the understanding that masculinity, or manhood as it were, exists on a spectrum, right? So you've got, your straight men, you've got gay men, you've got trans men, you've got, queer men. So it doesn't, gender and sexuality are completely different. And so how do you have a conversation with young men around that is very difficult, but really bringing those examples home, I think, is something that resonates significantly with them.
Mark?
I couldn't agree more, and I'd also like to add another buzzword that's hitting our marketplace of humanity, which is intersectionality. And so, I just, if we can just speak to anybody out there that feels that they have multiple affinities. Me myself, I've been disabled. I've gone through addiction. I'm LGBTQ. I'm a Christian. So I've learned how to tap into each one of those slices of my life and realize that they do fit into an intersectional pattern that's going to really make me that superhero. They're all part of me. And so I was disrespecting portions, some of those slices, and now they're all framed together in a very productive way. And so this is who I am. So I'm sure some of you that are on here can relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this webinar is providing the right kind of forum where men can hear about being vulnerable and walking into places of authenticity. We brought up a huge word. In fact, my practice is focused on how do you build and sustain intergenerational trust. So we use that word trust. What are some insights that you have and some thoughts you would have as what male Latinos can do in corporate America to demonstrate that they trust themselves as well as they trust their organization? What are some trust activities, some trust triggers, some trust exercises that people can engage in order to be successful in the corporate space? Dr. George, we'll start with you.
That's a really great question. I was thinking about something Mark said earlier, that the value of having essentially a group that you can turn to. One of the challenges that I've discovered is that we have all internalized all the stereotypes. They live in us like an archive of stereotypes. And they can, in any context that's toxic, they can be evoked. And there's incredibly powerful research, and of course our own experience bears that out. You find yourself in an environment and you're underperforming, and you can't quite put your finger on it. And what's happened is that the stereotype has been evoked unconsciously. You're underperforming, and they're powerful. Now, there's also a stereotype lift. You find yourself in an environment where the parts of yourself are honored and admired. You find yourself performing at a higher level. The issue of integration of all the parts of ourselves. It's almost like we have an internal war going on with different identifications and tribes, and we can actually internally have those things going on where we're devaluing parts of ourselves. So I really honor what you're saying, Mark, about integrating and embracing all the parts of yourself. Is a really key thing. But I cannot underscore enough the value of turning to a confidant or a small group of confidants and sharing the experience you're having, which can be incredibly dysregulating and turbulent when you find yourself in an environment that's challenging you with these kinds of unconscious stereotypes.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that, if I may.
Yeah.
So I started my career on Wall Street. I grew up in a farming community without an academic household, and I just kind of grassroots wise kind of figured things out in terms of how to place myself in my career as best as I could. One of the mistakes that I made early on, though, and then I figured out a magical formula, is I just siloed myself to the ERGs of whatever company I was with. The Hispanic affinity groups, which is a wonderful idea. They gave me so much community and love, and we had points of relatability. But I wasn't exposing myself to the other portions of the corporation. In other words, there was other groups that aligned with my interests, whether they'd be in fitness, whether they'd be in IT. And so when I figured out that I could be a member of the ERG, the Hola group, the Hispanic group, the Juntos group, and also be over here integrating myself and really marketing myself as somebody who wanted to be upwardly mobile in the company. And when I figured that out, I became the youngest national marketing director of a Fortune 500 in Austin, Texas. And I attribute it to that I busted out of the silos. And I still came back to that cultural ERG for the love and the cultural understanding that I needed to progress as a person and the familia aspect. But I was also cultivating some professional attributes in other places within the company.
And it sounds like, Mark, you were able to grow your trust of self by expanding your network, if you will, and seeing that you were able to flourish, not just in the own affinity group community, but in larger communities as well.
I was able to grow my trust as well for non-Latinos and Latinas, which was, I think, key.
It's such a powerful description of being able to embrace all the parts of yourself and find those ecologies that support those different parts of yourself and still feel that you're holding on to a sense of your core identity. Really important stuff.
Speaking of identity and speaking of corporate world, we are talking about Latino males in corporate America, and that is a shifting identity. For a decade, I spent time as a recruiter and got the to travel around the country and meet Latino males who were excited to join a variety of organizations. lots of aspiration, not sure that they had the skill sets to go forward. So I want to
Mm,
move into the career conversation now, if we will.
mm,
And George, I'd like you to sort of help our attendees by helping them understand how they can avoid being defined or trapped by
mm.
unconscious bias of someone else toward them because of their Latino male identity
Yeah,
or the
it's a,
perceived identity.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of talk about emotional intelligence. And when I train young psychologists, I realize they've got this wrong. They think it's just about being aware, but there's complicated parts to it. The first part is really beginning to notice that there's something off. So it's like that kind of, and I actually train people in meditation so they become aware.
Mm,
Our bodies are the source of most of the information we receive as human beings. So get to know what your body is telling you about safety, about comfort, about trust, and then begin that self-inquiry. What's going on with me? And then I think the third step is beginning to reach out to someone that you trust, a confidant, that you can begin to talk about this state before you act. I have a psychiatrist that I treat, and she's terrific. She says to me one of the things she learned in residency was keep your mouth shut until you can clarify what's the most productive and wise thing to do next. Yeah.
Sometimes people say silence is golden, right?
Right.
True. Jason, we've heard you refer a number of times to the mentor conversation. We like to call those in our practice, we call them having your own quote board of directors, right?
Mm,
People who have wisdom caps, if you will, and they
yeah.
take them off
Yeah.
to share. Jason, what do you think some of our listeners here should do in order to identify and integrate themselves and begin this process of putting together a group of mentors, finding a mentor, or having a group of wisdom cappers around them?
Hmm.
What are some actions
Yeah.
they could take to make that
Yeah.
process work?
So I'll say two things. One is actively search and seek opportunities to step out of your comfort zone. I think
Mm,
and that's very hard to do inside of corporate spaces because you've got promotions on the line, you've got
mm,
raises on the line, etc. But actively search for opportunities to make yourself slightly uncomfortable
Mhm.
within your control environment. Why? Because that's going to push you to learn. It's going to push you to grow as an individual. It's going to push you to embrace different circumstances, and more importantly, going back to the word trust that you mentioned, Jeff, you're gonna learn how to trust yourself in different spaces, and you're gonna learn that you are enough and you are able to move in certain spaces and have conversations and speak up in that meeting and deliver that presentation. But you won't know that, you won't know your limitations until you test them. So
Mm.
actively look for those opportunities. And then the second thing is what we're kind of alluding to now is, and I think to use corporate jargon for a second, every corporation has a board of directors
Yes, sir.
or a panel of advisors. I would recommend, and this is something that I'm actively doing now, is to build a personal board of advisors, right, in your life, like
mhm.
a life board of
Right.
advisors, because that's important. And I think if you have your career and your mentors, and then you've got your personal board of advisors, then hopefully between the advice that you're getting from both groups, you'll be able to start to think through and synthesize kind of who you are and how you show up in spaces and how you want to move forward. So I think those two things are critically important.
Mm. Mark?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have a cabinet. I do. I have a Secretary of
Yeah.
Defense, a Secretary of Energy, a Secretary of Commerce.
Uh, uh,
And I do. And it doesn't mean that those folks are going to be lifelong members with multiple terms, just like a board. Some folks should have expirations in terms of their service on this cabinet. But I definitely have zoned in with certain people in terms of they are going to be able to influence me as a person in terms of strength. They're going to be able to influence me in terms of tenacity. They're going to be able to influence me in terms of business. They're going to be able to influence me in terms of confidence. They're going to be able to influence me in terms of career positioning. And the most important cabinet role is that to perpetuate core values and purpose. And so for those of you who are with us today, I've asked several people today a simple question: what is your purpose? And most people have not been able to answer that. So I can answer that question, fortunately, because of the people around me in my life, and it's to exude energy and passion toward lifting up our Latino and Latina community so that it becomes a healthy, productive American society. So anyhow,
preach on, brother, preach on. Right there.
Right.
And listen, I think what you said, and again, going back to what Jason said, this personal board of directors, a 30-second story. When I started in the government, I had 5. They happened to be all Latino men, by the way, mentors. Each of them had 30 years experience.
Wow.
And at the time I started, we didn't have social media. You didn't have no texting. The only way you could talk with somebody was if you met with them in person or you called them. And I can remember relating to them, hey, I'm in this meeting and Johnny said this and Billy said that. And they'd say, well, listen, that guy's a meow meow, don't pay attention to him. And they would give me all this advice. And I would say, who the heck are you to give me that? You weren't even in the room. And then I got wise and I started to listen to that advice and realized that you don't have to be in the room to have a complete or general understanding of what's taking place.
Absolutely.
I had to learn how to listen. We just got a great question along these lines from an audience member, and I want to honor that. This individual says, my problem has been finding a confident, a mentor who shares my cultural upbringing. What do you suggest I do, or how should I approach it? And where can I find folks who can help me?
That's the $1,000,000 question. I think that's why we need more of all of us on this call to not only step up, but be more vocal and make ourselves available to young people as they grow, as they get out there. Unfortunately, in certain spaces, the tech industry, for example, financial services, our representation numbers are very low. So the odds of finding someone that you can gravitate to, that you can relate to and connect to is very, very low, or is lower than, say, in other fields. So, it's a challenge, and I'm not going to purport to know the answer to that question, but I will say that don't underestimate. I think good advice is good advice. Doesn't matter where it comes from. I think so. Search for that first. But yeah, I think there's definitely value in wanting to search for someone that looks like you, that gives you that good advice. And then I would also say, don't underestimate the value of mentorship outside of your field of expertise. Some of my best mentors aren't people that are in tech or in media or have never been in finance. Those are people that are professors. Those are people that either might not have ever gone to college sometimes, right? Some of that old age wisdom that comes from just, life experiences is invaluable. So think, maybe broaden your definition about what a mentor should look like, and then maybe start to seek that out in your circle of influence.
Mark?
Yes, I would echo that. I'm unmuted. Yes, the power of networking. Jason, you alluded to this. You've got to get out there. You got to get out there and keep your eyes wide open. And you're going to see people that you want to emulate or that are relatable to you. And there's going to be some what I call accidental discoveries along the way. That you're not going to realize that that person who delivered those comments had that relatability to you with their personal remarks or whatever. And that's how I've been able to generate some of my mentors, is in spaces that I didn't imagine that I would create that type of relationship.
Yeah.
George?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking back to something, Jason, you said earlier that, any direction in which we're trying to stretch ourselves is going to generate anxiety. And it gets us back to the issue of vulnerability and even being aware of the anxiety as a sort of sometimes unconscious impediment. And so when I tell my students, it's normal to feel anxiety if you're stretching, you're growing if you're feeling it, they feel relieved, because they often feel a sense of like, there's something wrong with me. Why am I feeling this anxiety? But then the question becomes, how do you because Jason, you were alluding to this idea of, It has to be tolerable, right? Sort of just in the right range, so you feel you're stretching but not overwhelmed. And that's an important judgment call, how to figure that out, how to move in directions that are stretching you. But I'm thinking also about how do you reach out? And I agree with you, Jason. We folks who have succeeded need to be giving back and finding ways to give back in the way they can. But finding mentors is an incredible gift. I tell people if you found one in your lifetime, you're really lucky and hang on to them. But one way is to find memories in yourself where you've gotten that, whether there was a good teacher you had way back in elementary school. I had a sixth grade teacher that I think transformed my life. I can go back into that experience and say I can find that again, and hopefully that can relieve some of the anxiety.
I'd add just two very, very quick points that I think might make sense. I try to live a Forrest Gump life when it comes to mentorship.
Uh-huh.
And if I come across somebody that I find interesting, whether it's
Uh-huh.
through media, Jason was talking about media, or
Uh-huh.
on the street, don't be afraid to use social media and reach out and write an
Mm-hmm.
authentic email to somebody.
That's
Ask
right.
them for a 15-minute information interview about their life, and
Uh-huh.
add this when you have that interview. I've researched you, and I'd like to work with you and serve in some capacity. How can I help you? So offer before you ask,
Mm-hmm.
give before you get.
Mm-hmm.
Make more
And I've been,
deposits than you do withdrawals.
come on now, come on.
Right.
You,
That's
Mark, and I
true.
work in the financial services industry. We know about that stuff. You have to.
Yeah. Yeah,
People
I have
have to
to.
know that you're
Yeah.
willing, and there's an intersection of generational stuff that's coming up here right now that I think is
Yeah.
important to note. I always, when we're mentoring young people, the first question I want to ask, before you tell me about your resume and what you want to do and the mentor you want, all that great stuff, I want to ask you a question. How do you rest? How do you rest the mind, body, and soul? Because you're about to go on a new adventure, going
Mm-hmm.
somewhere else, doing things
Yeah.
you have not done,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not in a rest. You want to go further on fumes than you have in fuel. And
Right.
sometimes what we have to do is remind people that we love them so much that we can't leave them in the place that they're in, and we've got
Mm-hmm.
to help them to prepare to do that. There was a
Yeah.
couple of questions that came in that were really to the point of the first question of how do you go about finding a mentor
Mm-hmm.
specifically. And I think all of us are saying the same thing. You've got to put yourself out there. You've got to seek them. They're not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
going to seek you. You've got to look to gain their wisdom, but offer them something in return, some access. One of the things you can always do if you're a young person is do reverse mentoring. I taught a workshop at the
Mm-hmm.
National Science
It's
Foundation
true.
recently. And there was a young
Interesting.
lady who
Yeah.
was who there was one older woman who asked a question. She says, all this generation stuff, Jeff, I want to know what the heck is this thing called Snapchat? Well, there was a young
Uh-huh.
lady in the audience who raised her hand. She said, I'll
Uh-huh.
show you what it is. Well, it wasn't just that one person that walked over. There were 10 scientists that went to the corner, and here it was this young lady was given a demo on what Snapchat. Look, you can get in there if you decide that you want to put yourself out there, but that's a decision that you want to make. The horse is down. I'm off the high horse, back to it. So
Uh-huh.
we got another great question that came in, and this is about confidence, and I'm going to relate it to corporate confidence. And we'll start with you, Mark. Have you experienced challenges in in your confidence, corporate confidence, that you think came up and showed up as a barrier, either because of, say, language or cultural upbringing? And what did you do to mitigate those challenges when they appeared?
The bottom line is I didn't back down. When I started my career on Wall Street, I had a very inappropriate comment. So it was back in 1990. If you don't get
Mm-hmm.
your blank together, we're gonna rip you a new blank.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
we feel like we have to hold your hand. We feel like we have to do that with the Hispanics around here.
Right.
Those are
Yeah.
the type of comments that I received. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
literally could have gone in a hole and just deteriorated, in addition
Mm-hmm.
to all the other things that I was going through. But
Mm-hmm.
you know what? I said, I'm not, if that's one thing that my dad did teach me well, is never to give up and back down. And so what I did is, I handled those situations, and I took the high road. I went through the channels that were very appropriate. And I did have the last word in each of those instances. And so I think what you all are saying is put yourself out of the comfort zone. And what I say all the time is, you know what? One of the biggest enlightenments for me was handling myself in a boardroom where I was the only, Latino or Latina in the room. And all these questions that I had, am I qualified enough? Should I really be here? And just to push through those items with your intellectual capital and your confidence, which will grow over time. But you've got to put yourself out there. And the other thing is to assess right after you deliver is to have a debrief. To have a debrief. What went well? What didn't go so well? What didn't go so well, was that based on preparation or was that based on a lack of confidence? So those are just a couple of pointers. And once I was able to frame that into that disciplinary approach, then it becomes more methodical and less subjective. And it becomes more about what could you have done better? Was the preparation on par? Instead of, do you have enough confidence to be delivering in that room?
Excellent. And I think it goes back to our conversation on self-reflection. Jason, what advice would you have for folks to increase and address their corporate confidence, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, that Mark's answer was right on the money. I was going to say, preparedness breeds confidence. So if you're prepared and then you constantly deliver, then over time, then that confidence will shine through. It's this I don't want to sound overly esoteric, but this is confidence of trusting yourself and trusting what you bring to the table. And that might not always be readily apparent, especially as folks of color. We have so many different hurdles to deal with just to kind of get a seat at that table and then perform. But I would say, be prepared even for the slightest of things, right? If they send you to go get coffee, be the darnest coffee getter there is. But just try to prepare and deliver above and beyond your job, and I think that'll help develop. And we're talking about specifically confidence and trust inside of the workplace. Yes. Those are the types of things that come to me.
In your work, George, what kind of confidence recommendations would you have for folks who are, again, trying to navigate this corporate workspace that on the surface may seem accepting, but in practice they raise sort of those micro aggressions that Mark alluded to earlier?
Yeah, there are all kinds of hidden minefields. Jason mentioned something that I think is worth revisiting: the idea of generosity. It's a challenge because many Latino men have an internal mental landscape where they need so much, but they've got to find a way to be generous to others, and it will be reciprocated. This is such an important issue. And confidence is built slowly with managing the challenges and the anxiety. And as again I mentioned earlier, you've got to reach inside and find. I argue these days that our memories are molecules of ourselves. They're really the building blocks and proteins of ourselves. And you've got to reach inside and find those memories where you had mentors, where you had someone supporting you, where you had success, and begin to incorporate that in the way you're moving forward in those anxious moments. Because, as I said earlier, whenever you're moving into new space, you're going to feel anxiety.
Yeah. Absolutely. So as we sort of get to our rounding third base here, coming home, I'd like to touch on specific activities that you think our attendees can do to build their Latino, their network. What would be one action step that you would ask people to do today or in the next 5 days? Again, giving them practical advice to step off the ledge. What's one or two things you would challenge them to do, maybe others have challenged you to do, in order to start building your network? Mark, we'll start with you. Oh no, Jason, go ahead, buddy. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say LinkedIn is a hell of a tool, and Facebook and all. I think we mentioned it earlier, social media. But one strategy that I've used is to look at my LinkedIn network and then look at the 1 or 2 degrees of separation. and then just reach out to folks. I think you might have mentioned this as well, Jeff, is, reach out to your primary network and then ask for introductions.
Yes.
There's nothing wrong. What the worst they can say is no, but if you're a one-to-one connection, I don't see why they wouldn't at least put an email together on your behalf. So, and then be willing to take a lot of people out to coffee, and keep it to coffee. It's less expensive than lunch.
15-minute coffees, and everybody's got to. That's a great. That keeps us within the budget, Jason. That's good stuff.
Absolutely.
Mark.
I would say right now I'm in Las Vegas. I'm here supporting a couple of alums of our scaling program that we run out of Stanford University. And so what I've really evolved and refined over time, if I'm in Vegas, there's bound to be another conference that I could dip my toe in.
Yeah.
And certainly
All right.
there's been 3 other ones, and I didn't need a full registration. But I said, this is compelling to me. This is a tech space. This is where some Latinos are, and so I would say, I know all of you on this webinar go to conferences. You're probably going to the Prospanica National Conference, and I'll see you there. The other thing is seeking mentorship. This is a very important point. If you're seeking mentorship from somebody who has a very demanding schedule, if you don't hear from them the first time, don't assume that they saw your message. And so be vigilant if that's important to you, but also keep your standards high. If you reached out to that person 4 or 5 times and they haven't responded for whatever reasons, I wouldn't take that personally. I would just say, I'm going to try to reach out to them 7 times. And by the 7th time I know, I'm going to move on to the next person. But just one time is not enough, especially for some of you. I'll give myself an example. If I see that message and I come to it and somebody's seeking help and there's points of relatability, you know what, I will take that call. It might not be immediately, but I will respond and say, when can we schedule some time together? And then the other thing I would add, because I know we're running out of time, is be real clear about what you're seeking out of the mentorship. I've written mentorship emails that were, 3 short paragraphs. These are what I'm looking for: 3 visits per year, 1 phone call for 15 to 20 minutes, 1 hangout space of any sort, and then 1 email interaction. So if you can be that clear and organized, I think it will also differentiate you.
That's perfect tactical knowledge. George?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely, Mark, correct. I myself, in my own development, I would go to every conference in my profession. It was extraordinary, and I'd pay my way. I'd find money. I'd find a mentor to give me some funding from somewhere. I'd go wherever I felt, God, I've got to learn, I've got to grow, and I've got to hear from the people that I admire. Really important. There's a simple exercise that I have some people do: pencil and paper. You put yourself in the center and you draw some concentric circles and start to outline who you know, who's connected to who, and you start to reach out to those rungs that are a little further out to begin to stretch your network, your ecology of connections, and reach out. The other day I had this amazing, pleasant experience as a mentor myself. One of my students, a black male, reached out to me and said, I'm really frustrated with the clinical placement I've got, and I need some money and stuff. And I said to him, I don't know. I don't have anything. Have you thought of this? And then afterward, I thought, God, are you kidding? I've got multiple connections. I emailed him. I said, look, connect with this person. I just got this email from a colleague. She's looking for somebody. It's amazing. Just asking and taking the risk comes back to you.
Yeah, and I would say absolutely challenge yourself. What I do when I speak all over the country, do a lot of public speaking, and I'll ask audiences, if you could spend 15 minutes with somebody in the country, who would that be? Write that name down.
Nice.
Wow. Yeah.
Do not limit yourself by what you've experienced. Write it down. And then during the exchange in the conference, share that name you wrote down with 3 people. You'd be shocked at who knows who and who has the capacity. And Jason's exactly right. Let those intros allow themselves to move forward. I would say that as we finish up, you gentlemen, you've done an outstanding job of relating information and relating advice to an eager audience. If you could give them just just maybe one word of advice if they're starting a new job and it's their first 90 days, right? And they want to make an impact. What would be the one or two things that they should do? And we'll do this real quick. Start with you, George, and then we'll round robin and end up here.
Oh, gosh. You know what it makes me think of is I had an administrative assistant years ago when we started Project Fatherhood, and when I was actually starting my bilingual bicultural program. He was an extraordinary human being. I would joke with colleagues. I would go, "He's begging for work." He would just show up and say, "What can I do? What can I do?" It was an extraordinary, just display of a human being that was really signing on for work, and I so appreciated it. Today, he is the director of our Project Fatherhood. He started out as an administrative assistant.
So you got lots of work. So beg for work. Go out there and get it. Thank you so much. Jason, what would your thoughts be?
My thoughts, I would say try to identify the winners right away. I think that that's evident by the people that gravitate around these people. You see, these are the people that are constantly copied on emails, constantly referred to, and you find those people and get on their calendar sooner than later, especially because within the first 90 days, I think expectations are still light for you, and you have the time to kind of wiggle and maroon a little bit and kind of get to know the lay of the land. So find those people and then start emulating their behavior, right? If they're in at 7 in the morning, get in at 7 in the morning, right? And I know that might scare a few millennials away, but start to emulate behavior that is successful, at least considered successful inside of that organization. That's going to look differently everywhere, but try to do that sooner than later so that you can start off and build that momentum that'll take you through your next 90 days, 120 days, etc. But you want to start that ASAP from day one.
Excellent. Mark.
Bring your best self to work. I mean, think of it at the other foot. If you were managing people, who would stand out to you? And what I mean by that is be on time, please. Be punctual. I mean, it is. We're losing that art. We're becoming a lot more flexible, but it's anyone can get to work on time, be on that conference call on time, download that GoToMeeting app in advance of the online, so that it appears that you're not prepared. The other thing I would say is be mindful of your writing in a text world. That well-crafted emails. Strike impressions, especially when you don't have tonality or you can't see somebody or talk to somebody on the phone to judge to assess inflections. And then just maintain your enthusiasm. Whatever fuels your enthusiasm, if it's fitness, if it's meditation, if it's going to church, if it's whatever it is, don't lose sight of those things that fuel your tank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wonderful. Gentlemen, on behalf of Prospanica, I want to thank you for your incredible insights. It was honestly a joy and an honor to exchange today with you, and I hope to continue to exchange with you as well. And I'm sure many of the folks online have that same level of appreciation. I would like to mention to those online that registration is open for the 2018 Prospanica Conference and Expo. It's happening in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I think it's September 12th through 14th. There are going to be lots of professional opportunities. This kind of dialogue will be taking place. You can witness it live. You can meet with Fortune 500 top-notch folks as well. You can learn about career opportunities. And so for some of you who are saying, well, where do I go and what can I do? Hello, the cake is baked.
Right.
It's going to be happening September 12th through the 14th. And so there will be a survey that's going to pop up soon for all of the attendees. I ask that you complete that survey. If you want to find out more about Prospanica, just head to their website, prospanica.org. There's information available for you. And then again, on behalf of the leadership of Prospanica and for all of our panelists, we thank you, audience members, for spending an hour so time with us today, and we wish you great luck and success in the future. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.